Welcome to the 2017 Public Lecture Series on the Wisconsin Idea, Past and Present. This lecture series is part of a course being taught by the Department of, under the auspices of the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Eric Sandgren. I'm a professor at the School of Veterinary Medicine and have the honor of serving as the instructor for the course this semester. The Wisconsin Idea has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society. The aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin's citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty in the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state about how the knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past and continues to do so today. Today's presentation is an outstanding example of that process. I encourage you to participate actively in the course through the course website at www.wiscidea.com. Now, 3 brief announcemements. First, next week, the lecture will be held across the street in the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery. It is being held as part of the Crossroads of Ideas series. So, be sure to show up there. If you come here, you may be kind of lonely. Although with like-minded people, at least.
Still kind of lonely.
Second, students be certain to sign the sign-in sheets if you are registered for credit for the course. And third, the sociology department is offering this course with limited resources from its academic and supplies and expenses budget. If you'd like to contribute to this project, please consider making a contribution to the Department of Sociology Annual Fund. You can do this through the website. We are fortunate to continue our series tonight with a lecture by Kevin Walters titled Think Local, Act Global, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, or WARF, and the Soil of the Wisconsin Idea. Kevin is a historian who works as a strategic research coordinator at WARF. He's also a PhD candidate in history here at UW-Madison, studying the intellectual and institutional history of the United States and writing an intellectual biography of biochemistry professor and WARF founder, Harry Steenbach. Like all of our speakers, he is graciously donating his time and expertise, free of charge, out of a commitment to public service. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Walters.
So how about me? Can everybody hear me? Is the mic picking me up well? Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. I do want to give a shout out to Crossroads of Ideas. My colleagues at WARF are responsible for that programming, so I'm glad to see that we could be collaborating with them across the street there. Eric also mentioned Adlai Stevenson in the introduction, as he usually does, and my dad's family is from Bloomington, Illinois, which is actually the home of Adlai Stevenson, the boyhood home. And he told me a story that when he was growing up, English teachers would have them diagram the political speeches of Adlai Stevenson, and they were usually very long sentences and usually grammatically correct. I will leave it to you to compare and contrast that with your political figure choice. I think he's actually a fascinating political figure because he's a quintessential intellectual politician, and I think it's an interesting. I don't know that he fully embodies the Wisconsin idea, but I think he's an interesting polarizing figure.
Illinois.
In that sense, yeah. Well, that too, yes. All right, so I wanted to draw attention to my title a little bit with this cartoon, which I found actually just last week. It says, does the rooster envy the eagle as he soars through limitless space, or the eagle envy the rooster who's a king in his own little place? I actually just happened across that last week. It was in the La Crosse Tribune in December 1926. It was a syndicated cartoon. I think it illustrates the eagle is global, the rooster is local, and it's not just about 10,000 feet or the ground, it's about how those two things think about each other and how we should do it. And so I think you've probably heard the term think global, act local more often, and I'm flipping that. So I just wanted to point that out. I wasn't making a mistake. And then the next way to illustrate the Wisconsin idea, this is a map from the Upshot, which is the New York Times data analysis blog. What they did was they went to Facebook and they downloaded likes of college football teams. And they distributed it all the way down to zip codes. And so they show basically who likes which football team where. I will point out, my dad's from Oklahoma. I grew up right here. So you can see there's a little bit more of a divided loyalty situation where I grew up than there is in Wisconsin. And not only, I think, not just, Wisconsin stands out on this map. Maybe Nebraska, maybe Ohio State, but if you drill into it, they don't really compare. And the Upshot even, deep devotion in Wisconsin. That's not Republican red, that's Badger red. The most consistently loyal fans in America live in Wisconsin. More than 87% of fans in some zip codes, they said that they found a higher level of support, a more consistent level of support in Wisconsin than anywhere else. So if you want to talk about thinking local, go to Wisconsin. So before we get into the Wisconsin idea anymore, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own methodology and what my background is. As Eric said, I study institutional and intellectual history. Intellectual history used to be about big ideas about philosophers, theologians, about morality and death and life and all those kinds of things. And thanks to social and cultural history of the last 30 years or so, maybe a little longer than that actually, it's become broadened. And it's really more about how do people think about things. Anybody, any historical actors, how do ideas shape history? And so what I do is I study the intellectual history of institutions. So I actually have two advisors, Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, who her first book was on American Nietzsche, about how American ideas influenced Nietzsche, and then how Nietzsche influenced America, both of those things. My other advisor is John Hall, military historian. You may have seen him in the news. He's now working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on a counterterrorism history. So you have in my two advisors, you have American intellectual history, American institutions. Not to say that just the military is an institution, but he studies a particular kind of American institution. That's my background. And so I want to explain what that means. And I've tried this on undergrads, and I know only a few of you are students. Hopefully this will work. We'll see. This is what you call a hashtag. How many people here know what a hashtag is, or what Twitter is? Ah, good, okay. You're caught up. Just for those who may be listening at home, a hashtag is a keyword. It's something that you on social media, and if you put that number sign in front of a term, it makes it a keyword, and it acts like an index, really. So if you click on that term, you can go to Twitter, and you can see all of the posts of people who've hashtagged their posts with this particular term. And the term I'm choosing today as our example is YOLO. The interesting thing about this is that there's no editor or author who determines what hashtag YOLO means. People who are on Twitter who decide to put that in their post, they decide what it means. And so it's sort of a crowdsourcing. And I think that's an interesting way to study kind of an interesting metaphor for how I look at ideas. So YOLO started with these two gentlemen, Drake and Lil Wayne. They had a song called The Motto. And what they'd said, the motto was you only live once, YOLO. And if you know the song, you know I skipped a word in that lyric. So they use that in a song. It becomes popular, it becomes a hashtag. So the Washington Post says the newest acronym you'll love to hate. This is Urban Dictionary. They describe it there. This person apparently didn't like the term. Then you don't have to read all of this. This is basically saying that Drake started to say you should pay me if you use that term. And they say, well, actually it predated him. There's actually other people who use stuff like this. He didn't have any claim to ownership. He can't really do that. Then, of course, the sign of any true cultural relevance, it has a Wikipedia page. I would like to point out as a person of German descent that everything does go back to Goethe. One lives but once in the world. It also has Mae West, Johann Strauss. I mean, this is basically saying it isn't just rap songs. It goes back much further than that, and it's simpler to carpe diem. Then you have the countertake, the classic countertake, in which this guy says that YOLO is what you say shortly after saying, hold my beer, I got this. So by the time he's writing this, what he's saying is that YOLO has been adopted by, generally speaking, college students who go out and do something stupid, and then they brag about it because, hey, I did something stupid, but you only live once. And what he's saying is that, like, that's not the point. That's not the idea, right? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. And then my favorite is Jack Black, who said, I'm fairly certain YOLO is just carpe diem for stupid people. So YOLO, what is it exactly? These are all the definitions. We don't have to go through them in too much detail. But I started with Drake. We have acronyms you love to hate. This is all the things I just showed you. And it shows you over the course of basically 5 years. And then again, by 2014, Drake goes on Saturday Night Live and he says, I want to publicly apologize for foisting this thing upon you because everybody's kind of tired of it. So this shows you how an idea changes over time, right? And it shows you that nobody can really own it. And once it gets out there in the public sphere, once people start using it, and the more they use it, the more that it becomes a phenomenon unto itself. And the more that it's about an interchange, really. It's not just about the author or the receiver, the reader. It's about a negotiation between those two things. So Wisconsin idea. Here's some similar things, and if you're here for Gwen's talk, and I hope you were, or I hope you've been able to watch it since then, you'll recognize some of these quotes. We start with John Bascom in the Social Gospel. I didn't really find a quote for that. But you have sifting and winnowing. You have the beneficent influence the university reaches every family. You have the marketing slogan from the 30s, which is the boundaries of the university, the boundaries of the state. Then that turns into from reaches every family to reaches every home, and up until a couple years ago, that actually is what the Wisconsin Idea webpage on wisc.edu said. Several people in the room may have actually been instrumental in getting them to change that to the proper original slogan. So these are all the different slogans, right? And it shows you that the Wisconsin idea has meant a lot of different things. It's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And then ultimately, even when you have Charles McCarthy, who is sort of, let's call him the Drake of the Wisconsin idea. No, let's don't call him that, actually. So even in that book, he says, we have followed a long and winding path. There's no categorical explanation of the Wisconsin idea, which you kind of, I haven't actually sat down and read the book all the way through. I've read parts of it a lot, but I think if I got to the book and he said that, it's kind of like, well, what's this supposed to mean? The real difference, though, between YOLO and the Wisconsin idea is people really, really care about the Wisconsin idea. I don't even know that Drake cares that much about YOLO, right? It's a big deal. It matters to people. And so this isn't just hashtags. This is something that is really ingrained in the spirit of Wisconsin. It's an article of faith for people. This is, of course, you probably recognize it, the drafting error, as it came to be called. This was the Republican budget. It shows you the striking out so states' workforce needs is being put in here, and they're cutting out knowledge and its application beyond the boundaries, and they're cutting out the basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. It took basically 24 hours for this to cause a little bit of a stink. The chancellor herself on Twitter, of all places, is challenging that, saying that the Wisconsin idea will always be central to the mission of the university. And she's obviously not the only one. I think many people in this room were probably posting on social media about this is not a good idea. I agree with that, by the way. I'll put my cards on the table. I take the chancellor's side on this. And within hours, Scott Walker backed down. And the Republican, or whoever's responsibility it was, I actually can't speak authoritatively on whether it was a drafting error or not, but it took 24 hours for this to be changed. This shows you that people really care. I thought I'd throw a little more slang. So, I didn't build pause for laughter into my time. But the other thing, though, about this, to me as a historian, I mean, as I said, I'm on the side of the chancellor in this fight. I think it matters. I think that language should stay in the law. But also as a historian, I know that law was added in the 1970s. That's when the law was changed. And for my mind, the Wisconsin idea is bigger than the law. I think the law is important, but I think it's bigger than that, right? It's something that's more, it's something that goes beyond that. I think we can actually quibble with whether the first line they're trying to cut out is the Wisconsin idea, or the second line is the Wisconsin idea. What does that mean? How do we debate all of that? So what do we learn by this comparison other than a little bit more about the history of hip hop? To comprehend an idea, how it works, you have to see how it works at IRL, in real life. I'm sticking with the hashtags. You have to understand how it works in practice, how it works over time, and across all the people who use it. All the people who use it reproduce it and alter it in the same way that a Xerox copy reproduces in a slightly different way, but it also still retains the same characteristics of the concept. I don't think you can understand an idea without the words that express it, but I also think that the idea resonates beyond those words. So when we say sifting and winnowing, people kind of understand, okay, that's part of the Wisconsin idea. We don't really exactly know how, we don't have to pin it down. We know that it's not just the words. And then the more people who use an idea, the more people who care about it, the more ingrained and institutionalized as it becomes. But by that very fact, it becomes harder to define in simple terms because so many people care. Like I said, it's almost an article of faith. In the same way, if you read through a bunch of tweets that had YOLO tagged on it, you would get a sense of what it means without ever really being able to define it. And I think the Wisconsin idea, as over 90 years as opposed to the last 5, has done that. We all kind of, it just becomes part of our life when we live here. And just in case you didn't connect the dots, this is what I'm getting at. Sifting and winnowing. So how do you do that? How do you talk about the Wisconsin idea if it is 90 years and if there's 6,000 freshmen who came on campus and they probably already have 6,000 different definitions of the Wisconsin idea? how do you talk about that? Well, the first thing you do is you ask Glenn Jury to come talk to you. And then you have some schlub like me come out and do a case study to explore it, to figure out how it resonated. Again, IRL, how did it work? So how many people here have heard of WARF, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation? That's good. That's more hands than I normally get when I give these talks. And I usually talk to people who work at the university. But how about warfarin? Warfarin or vitamin D? Okay. You're all going to raise your hands. You're going to raise your hands. I was actually at Discovery Building across the street, and I was talking to a woman, and she said, where do you work? And I said, I work at WARF. She said, WARF? What's WARF? And I said, oh, in the building down by Lake Mendota. She said, WARF? There's a wharf in Lake Mendota? So I like to clarify that this is things that WARF is not. But this is what WARF is. It's what's called a technology transfer office. That's essentially the industry term for what we call academic patenting. It means that WARF takes the research on campus, patents it and commercializes it. Commercialize it means licensing it to a company so they can turn it into a product. It then takes the proceeds, the licensing royalties from that product, invests it into an endowment, and then uses that endowment to fund grants back to the university in support of research. A couple of points on this slide to point out, WARF is an independent institution. It's a nonprofit 501c3 supporting organization, to use a technical term from the IRS. As a supporting organization, it means it's different than, say, like the Gates Foundation. WARF is obligated to give its money to the organization that's mentioned in its charter, which is UW-Madison and now the Morgridge Institute for Research. But I also like to explain to people a little bit how WARF fits in. And I like to use the term multiversity, which is a coin that was coined by Clark Kerr back in the 1960s. He said the university is a whole series of communities actively held together by a common name. So it's not just one organization, it's multiple organizations. And I think if you think about this in the Wisconsin idea, this is something that is pretty central to what Wisconsin is. It's not just Bascom Hill, and it's not just this lecture hall. It's something that stretches beyond. It's kind of hard to conceptualize. It's governed in lots of different ways. You cut on a lighter moment, he would also say this, which is individual entrepreneurs held together by agreements on parking, and the central problems are sex, athletics, and parking. And I think as a good administrator, he was probably opposed to all those things: no sex, no parking, and no football. But that's all to basically get you to the point that this is kind of how WARF works. And this is actually, I want to thank Dean Emeritus Charles Reed. I borrowed this slide from him. I hope he doesn't mind. This gives you essentially, the higher picture, the global view of what UW-Madison looks like. And you could probably, each one of these bubbles could also have an entire chart like this for themselves. And of course, it's a little out of date. WAA and UW Foundation have now merged into WFAA. And I'm sure that there's some institutes and things that are missing. Another way to look at this is through finances. This is from the Chancellor's Budget and Brief from 2016 to 2017, the latest I could get my hands on. This shows you how things are divided up. So, by the way, if you work for the university and somebody comes up to you and says, what are you doing with my money? Be sure to only explain 15% of what you do. Getting some applause there. So WARF is part of this purple part here. I'm not getting this. Okay. WARF is part of the purple 17% right here. And I think that's important to show you that it's part of that 17%. And then within that 17%, this takes that 17% and breaks it out. The red part is UW Foundation. These are gifts to athletics, non-federal grants, and this green part is what WARF contributes. We like to call it the margin of excellence. It's meant to be a targeted research grants to really improve things and not just sort of like a replacement for these other stuff. This breaks down what that grant consists of. Actually, that green slice is really only this 52 or 55.2 million base grant. We also support the Morgridge Institute across the street with about $14 million. There's other kinds of support. Everything that WARF does is an in-kind grant. That means the university does not pay for it. It's free of charge to inventors on the campus. And there's other various projects and things that sometimes the Vice Chancellor of Graduate and Research Education, VCGRE, will sometimes come and ask us for money, and we'll talk with them about that. WARF goes all the way back to 1925. And in that fact, it's actually one of the oldest, and I think probably the oldest continuously operating technology transfer office in the world. The mission statement is this right here: to promote, encourage, and aid scientific investigation and research at the University of Wisconsin, but of faculty, staff, alumni, and students thereof. You'll notice it doesn't say University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's because this was before the merger. It was only University of Wisconsin back then. And this is from 2016, the latest copy of WARF's Articles of Incorporation. And you'll see that it's basically the same. Two differences are we've added Madison because it's only this campus. WISIS is an organization that for most of the system campuses does the same thing that WARF does. And then UW-Milwaukee has its own technology transfer office. So WARF is only for UW-Madison and the Mortgage Institute, which is attached to it, that WARF helps to fund. And over this past year, employees at WARF, and I was an actor in this, not an historian, we did a strategic plan and updated. This didn't change our charter, but this is kind of how we articulate it in terms of branding, how we brand our own vision and mission. Enable University of Wisconsin research to solve the world's problems and to support scientific research within the community through financial support, actively managed assets, and moving innovations to the marketplace. So I gave a presentation similar to this up in the Wisconsin Dells. We'll get to why I was in the Dells a little bit later. But a woman stopped me here and she said, "What do you mean by the world's problems?" And I was maybe being a little self-conscious, but the way that I took that was, what do you mean by the world? What about Baraboo? What about Sauk County? And I think she was also saying, what do you mean Madison? Like for her, Madison is the world, right? That's the global, that's the cosmopolitan. And I think it gets at something very important about the Wisconsin idea, and I think that's something that WARF is so much central to sort of figuring out, which is, what's the difference between the Wisconsin idea and what every other university says? My alma mater, UT Austin, if you watch a football game with the Longhorns, they'll usually have a commercial in there that says, what starts here changes the world. Princeton says, in the nation's service and in the service of humanity. And lots of places have a lot of different kinds of things. So what makes this different? And why did the trustees say the world's problems if this is UW-Madison? And I can answer that question, actually, which is what they were getting at, which is if you go back here to the original, we included a part, it actually wasn't in the original one, it was added later. For the overall benefit of humankind is in there. And the idea is that this isn't just about making money, it's about benefiting humankind. And it's also meant to be ambitious, it's meant to think big. So that's what they had to say. I'm not necessarily saying that as, I understand why people may say, but actually you should just say, all you should do is just give grants to the University of Wisconsin and leave the rest of it out of there. I understand why people say that, but this is what the trustees want to say, is we want to do more than that. We want to do big things because we think this university is capable of big things. So to explain all this, I want to give you this is where we get to the history. This is Harry Steenbach on the left. He's the founder of WARF, founding inventor. He's a biochemistry professor. He got his PhD here. He was an undergrad from 1904 to 1908, earned his PhD in 1916. The very first publication, actually it wasn't the first publication, the very first experiment he participated in was the single grain ration experiment. How many people know the single grain ration experiment? Less hands there. Single grain ration experiment was, they took 4 groups of cows. They fed one group corn, another group oats, another group wheat. I think I'm getting those crops right. And they chemically altered them to make sure that they had the same amount of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, because the prevailing nutritional theory at the point said all you have to do is eat those 3 things, and that's all you need for nutrition. And a lot of people have been poking holes in that and pointing out that, so Stephen Babcock, who you probably know, professor here, said, I could give you a lump of coal that had the exact proper amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fats, and I'm not going to feed that to a cow. In fact, he said, actually, what comes out of a cow is very similar to what you're saying we should put into the cow. And so in 1890, he came up with this idea, and then 2 decades later, Steenbach was a graduate assistant working with E.B. Hart, who ran the experiment, and essentially it's one of the key foundational moments in the history of vitamins, because what they discover is that the cows who ate corn had healthier babies. The cows who ate wheat, stillborn calves. And so it showed that there's something in corn there. And so what Steenbach then did when he became a professor is he started looking at the correlation between the yellow in the corn and what vitamin might be there. And ultimately somebody else figured out that that's carotene, which is not actually vitamin A, it's something that helps your body process vitamin A, but that there is vitamin content in corn. And in the process of doing that, he figured out that he could concentrate the vitamins. He figured out that he could take different kinds of vegetables, withdraw the vitamin A from them. He actually called it the fat-soluble vitamin, because they had not quite understood that there was A and D were 2 separate things. This is in the early 1920s. And he figured out how to concentrate it, and he said, what he realized was that the difference between butter and margarine is that butter is yellow, butter has vitamin A, margarine doesn't. So he understood that an oleomargarine maker could take his concentrate and make it compete with butter. He tried to get this patented. The university sort of went along with it. They weren't really that interested. They didn't put any money into it. They didn't really care. They just kind of let him do his thing, and eventually it expired before he could get a patent on it. He comes up with another invention, which is that he understood that if you put cholesterol or ergosterol under ultraviolet light, you could fortify food with vitamin D. And this time, having learned his lesson, he went to the university and they said, we're not really sure if we apply for this patent, we're going to get our money back, so universities don't really do this right now. And so he went to this next guy in the middle, Harry Russell. Harry Russell was the dean of the College of Agriculture, and so he was Steenbock's boss. He had worked with Babcock on things like the cold curing of cheese. He was famous for discovering tuberculosis in cows and showing farmers how to test their cows for tuberculosis. He helped found the hygiene lab, which is a couple doors down here. Russell understood, this is after World War I, he understood that a public university like UW-Madison was going to be struggling to compete with places like Harvard and Princeton because we didn't have a private endowment. And he was concerned about that. So what he saw in Steenbock's idea was a new way to administer research funding, a new way to get money for the university. And so he sent Steenbock to Charles Slichter. Charles Slichter was the dean of the graduate school. If you go to Memorial Library, there's a quote from him on Memorial Library. I'll let you go find out what it is, because I can't remember it right now. He was very instrumental, and in fact, he's beyond Wisconsin. He actually was, several of his students went on to run the Ford Foundation. He was very instrumental in terms of how graduate education was funded, how it was organized. And he really put some teeth into the research committee on campus, which is where faculty get together and decide how the fluid research funds are going to be spent. What Slichter then did was he went out into his network of alumni, and he found 9 alumni who he recruited who were willing to actually give money to help create WARF. And he found two different, I tend to divide them into two different groups. First is the lawyers. This is George Haight on the left. He was, by the time he died, he was referred to as Wisconsin's #1 alumnus. They said he would go into groups of students and alumni and give them a rousing speech, and they'd all get their checkbooks out. He was also very important in securing the funding for the Memorial Union building. This is actually him talking at the opening of that. And these other guys are Timothy Brown, who he's in the center there. He went on to become a Chief Justice of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. This is Evan Evans. He was a federal judge, and this is Harry Butler, who actually wrote those 1925 articles that I showed to you. What they did together was Haight was a lawyer. I left that part out. He was a lawyer in Chicago. He actually was the first lawyer to win $1 million fee by suing the telephone company. And they devised a legal strategy. And they devised how we're going to license things, how we're going to use patents, how we're going to use the legal implements to commercialize Steenbock's invention, and then how we're also going to take other professors' inventions and do that. The second group was what I'd call the financiers. This is Tom Brittingham Jr., Junior, not senior. His dad is the one who's named most of the parks, and the Abraham Lincoln statue was paid for by his father. Brittingham Park is named after his father. His father died in 1924 when Brittingham was 25, and so his life was, he was literally a trust fund baby. Not literally a baby, he was 25. But he was, he managed his father's fortune, and that's what he did. And the Brittingham Family Trust still exists today. This is William S. Keyes. He was a Wall Street investor, UW graduate. All of these are alumni, as I mentioned. And that's Lewis Hanks. He was actually the president of the First National Bank. And so primarily with Brittingham, but also with Keyes' help, they decided we're not just going to take royalties and give it straight back to the university. We're going to build an endowment. We're going to invest that endowment, and we're going to turn that money into a long-term source of income for the university. And this wasn't the first time that somebody had done that. Rockefeller and Carnegie had obviously done that before. But Brittingham had a particularly, actually found this out yesterday, that he would do what we called rosebuds, which is you don't bet on the fully bloomed rose, you bet on the rosebud. He would also use a racehorse analogy. He would say you don't bet on Secretariat after he won the Kentucky Derby. You try to find who's going to win the next Kentucky Derby. He entered a contest with Barron's Weekly, what they called the Widows Contest, which what they said was, imagine that there's a widow, she comes to you with her money. What are you going to do? And we're going to call, and whoever we think has the best idea, we're going to give you the prize. He didn't win because they thought he was way too aggressive. But years later, he wrote an article on why he had actually been one of the best performers, because he had done what I just told you, which is he was aggressive, and it really relied on being an astute investor. But it all wasn't just, I could tell that story the way I just told it, and it would be a seamless story about these geniuses who came up with this idea, and it all worked out great. That's actually not what happened. The first thing I want to say is that there were plenty of alternatives. This is Babcock on the left. Babcock actually said that he did not patent the butterfat test. We talked about the butterfat test last week. The butterfat test standardized testing for milk. It allowed people to be able to measure their milk, and it made sure that consumers would be able to count on what they were getting when they bought. It's like the reason we can have 1%, 2% skim milk is because of the butterfat test, and lots of other things. He didn't patent it, and in his opinion, actually, because he didn't patent it, there were a lot of shoddy versions of the Babcock test that went out, and it actually took several years for state regulations to come in and actually make sure that the Babcock test worked. But there were a lot of people who would point to Babcock as saying, this is what a scientist should be. He should not patent. He should give his invention free to the world. He was called the laughing saint of science, the world benefactor. He won all kinds of international prizes. And a lot of times they would say, he doesn't care about money. He doesn't want money. He'd actually die rather wealthy, I should point out, but he, not because he got money off of the butterfat test, but because he was an astute real estate investor and things like that. And this is Daniel Grady. He was a regent in the 1920s. He was a La Follette progressive. He was appointed by La Follette, I believe. And La Follette died in 1925, during the summer before WARF was founded. And as part of a memorial, part of a grieving process, I guess you could say, Grady sponsored a resolution which said that the university could not accept donations from endowed funds or organizations of similar character. I don't know that I got that exactly right, but that's basically what they were saying was don't want to take any Rockefeller money. We don't want your industrial capitalist money that taints the university. We're not going to let you take it. The immediate impact of that was that there was a donation to the medical school from the Rockefeller General Education Board that was turned away. I always get the decimal place wrong. It was either $50,000 or $500,000. It was a significant amount of money. And actually, they then had to clarify it. Okay, not every endowment, just the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. And then later they repealed it. But that's what was happening. And then a month later, Grady sponsors the resolution for the Board of Regents that allows the creation of WARF. And so I point that out because to our mind, that might be a little counterintuitive. But for him, it wasn't. It was really more about the Rockefellers and the big industrials, not necessarily about the local guys. I think I haven't sort of found the document that says what Grady was thinking, but I think that's a fair interpretation. This is Edward Burge. He was the president of the university at the time, and he was the one who basically, when Steenbach came to him, he just tried to ignore Steenbach. He tried to make it go away because he was about to retire. He was about to be replaced by President Glenn Frank. Burge just basically didn't really want to deal with it. He knew that the Grady Resolution was happening. He knew that something like patenting would probably be controversial. And so he tried to make it go away. And the reason WARF exists is because he didn't set up a committee within the university to make it happen, which is what Columbia had done, and what the University of Toronto had done. And this is Charles Burgess. He was a chemical engineer on campus. He then became a consultant for the French battery company, which you may now know French as Rayovac. And he founded a separate company, the Burgess Battery Company. He then got in a lawsuit with the French battery company over patents. He accused the French battery company of, this is in 1923, about the time that Steenbach's thinking about patenting. He accused the French battery company of infringing his patents. He eventually left Madison, I think because of labor costs was the reason he cited it. He actually moved his company to Illinois. And so those are the people who are the alternatives. That's the idea that tells you this could have gone some other direction. The WARF wasn't a fait accompli. It was also a contested idea. It was also a lot of different ideas were swirling around trying to make this happen. There were also people who were downright opposed to WARF at the time. This is Alfred Glover. He was the editor of Hoard's Dairyman, the influential dairy magazine. And when Harry Russell talked to him about the patents at first, he seemed to be on board. He later said he was in a daze when he was listening to him, and then later snapped out of it and thought, wait a minute, Babcock didn't patent. You shouldn't patent this. And basically what he was saying was the dairy industry shouldn't have to pay for your patents. Of course, what Russell said, and what Slichter said, and what Steenbach said is the whole reason we want to do this is so the oleo people can't take this, right? And that's but they had a back and forth about, okay, is this the right way to be doing this? It was a pretty big argument. This is F.B. Morrison. He was actually about the same age as these guys. I just could only find a later picture of him. He was the assistant dean to Russell. So when Russell is overseas, he talks to Glover and he sends a long letter to Russell saying, I didn't say this to Glover, but quite honestly, I have some questions about this whole WARF idea. I'm not really sure. First of all, I'm a scientist. I'm not really sure that I should be worried about making money. I don't think we should patent things just to make money. He also said, the farmers are really important to us, and I'm not sure that these WARF alumni are going to be on our side. I'm sure they're great businessmen. I'm sure they'll make some decisions, but I have some questions about whether this is the right way to go. Ultimately, he said, though, I disagree with Glover. You're absolutely right. If you do not control this, the margarine people will use it, and we can't even allow the appearance that we are actually doing anything that would endanger the dairy industry because we rely on their support. And this is William Evue, who is the progressive editor of the Capital Times. If nowhere else, you've probably seen his name in the press box at Camp Randall. He was, like Grady, was a progressive, but he did understand what we would probably assume was he thought this is a closed corporation. This is somebody they're going to use the university's name, whether we want them to or not. They will associate this with the university, and it should be public. He was a true line progressive, which he said all of the funding from the university should come straight from the taxpayers. That was his position. And for decades, the Capital Times would published Steenbach's personal tax records to try to figure out WARF's finances. They were always going after WARF for a very long time. I understand that I did not meet this person, but I think there's an employee at WARF who said he only bought the Capital Times to line his birdcage. And then this guy over here is Wendell Berge. He was the head of the antitrust division during during World War II. He got a hold of WARF, and he decided that the vitamin D patents were a cartel. It was a monopoly of vitamin D, and WARF wasn't licensing to margarine. Therefore, margarine was this wasn't actually his term, it was a judge's term, but they said margarine is the butter of the poor. There are poor children who are dying because of WARF. And he published a book called Cartels. There was an entire chapter on the vitamin D cartel, and he basically said WARF is just a front. That's all it is. And one of his exhibits was that WARF, prior to the Nazis coming to power, WARF had a license with IG Farben, which is a German company. And because that license, I don't think it was actually still in effect by the war, but he cited that as evidence that this was a fascist international cartel. I don't think that's actually right, by the way. I think I should point that out. That WARF did not have a monopoly on vitamin D. It had a patent on a particular way of fortifying food with vitamin D. You can't have a monopoly on vitamin D unless you can have a patent on walking out into the sunlight. So just, I want to let you make up your mind about some of these things, but that one's a little too far, I think. So I go through all of this to kind of say that this is something that was a contested situation. And the reason why WARF came out was not because Steenbach had this brilliant idea. I think he did have a brilliant idea. He did get the idea for WARF from a patent lawyer and a chemist from Chicago who had published something. And actually somebody at Quaker Oats, who was WARF's first licensee, introduced him to this particular article. But it wasn't just sort of sprung out of his mind. It's similar to YOLO. It's similar to the Wisconsin idea. This is something that came about because people were arguing over this. People who deeply cared about this university and who cared about Wisconsin were fighting about it. And what happened is you end up with these three functions, the scientists, the lawyers, and the financiers, coming into what I just showed you before, which is a cycle of innovation, which means that WARF is not just a company like the Burgess Battery Company or a separate research corporation that gives grants away. It's something that's a supporting organization. It's not just a branch within the university. It's not just an administrative office in Bascom Hall somewhere. It's a separate organization that incorporates all these things. And I think it's also important to point out that a lot of these people, all these alumni, they're not just being asked to donate money. They're being asked to serve the university. This is a Wall Street financier, a trust fund guy, a Chicago lawyer. Most of the trustees in the past 90 years have not lived in Madison. And WARF is one of those things that draws them back. And it gets them to serve. And I think it is an open question as to whether they've always made the right decisions, and I think they've all admitted that they've made some mistakes along the way. I do think it was a mistake to not license margarine. There's no reason not to. I don't think it's true that if you look at I didn't put this in the presentation, but if you look at the incidence of rickets over time, it does go down. And there's no doubt that Steenbach's invention was instrumental in preventing rickets, which is what vitamin D cures. But at the same time, there's no reason to withhold margarine. And I think that's something that's a very interesting part of Wisconsin history, is that this animus towards margarine. There's another way to put the cycle of innovation, and this is WARF's logo. It's a Fibonacci sequence, an adaptation of that. And these are all the inventions. You start with Steenbach, and then you come out through all of these things. I'll look at time here. I want to leave some time for questions, so I might rush through some things. But I think a good way to sum up why this cycle of innovation can seem somewhat confusing, and why it really is not just one idea, it's a collision of ideas, is through these two quotes. This is something of a wordy slide, I apologize, but I think I wanted to put this out there. Steenbach said in 1940 that the purpose of a research foundation was to prevent the socialization of the university by providing a means for tangible evidence that it has service to the state at heart, and means for a technical institution to meet its social obligations. 5 years earlier, Russell had said something that sounds almost exactly like the opposite if you take it in isolation, which is that WARF is an experiment in socializing profits, so that it doesn't just benefit an individual, it benefits the entire research enterprise. Now, if you read these and you read the context of these, they're really saying something very similar, which is that the idea of WARF is to make sure that we make money and then take that money and give it back to the university to serve university research needs. But you can literally say what WARF is doing is preventing the socialization of inventions by patenting them, and then socializing the revenue by giving it back to university. And so, like as the title of the slide says, it's socialism, but it's socialism in a rather capitalistic kind of way. And I think that's kind of the paradox that it's at the heart of why I think WARF is, I like to say that it's been copied but never duplicated. I can't give a presentation on WARF and not put these two quotes up there, which is that Steenbach in that same document said, the university is not primarily a money-making institution, but when The state fails to have the intelligence to fund the university. We need somebody to go out and show them what a university can do. So that's part of also what WARF is doing, is we can say things like vitamin D irradiation, warfarin, the Worcester coding process, stem cells. Those are all things that WARF has been involved in. And then Russell said, kind of the same, this was something that when Morrison wrote in that letter, this was Russell's response to that, which is we have to do something to keep up with the private endowments. And going to the legislature every year and trying to remind them again why this is an important place to be, we can't just rely on that. We have to do something for ourselves sometimes. And so then how does this play out? Like I said, this is about IRL, in real life, in practice. How does this go along? Well, the Steamboat patents expire in 1945. They're actually in the middle of a court case that is Bergey's accusations are in the middle of this about whether the patents are actually valid. And WARF is fighting them because they want to make it a test case and say, we do think it's valid, this is not patenting sunlight. But ultimately, they dedicate the patents to the public to sort of move on because they don't want to spend too much money litigating patents that they would otherwise give the university. So what they do instead is they build this building, which is on Walnut Street. That's the Forest Products Laboratory over there in the right side. This is WARF's old building. WARF's new building is a couple blocks over to the right where I work today. They build that, and that becomes a laboratory and offices, an institute. And the other thing I like to point out is one of the reasons why WARF is successful is you'll notice WARF starts investing in 1928. There's probably no time in history that you want to get into the stock market than in 1928. Especially because most of the money they put in was after that. And so this shows you the graph. This is actually from that article I told you that Tom Brittingham wrote, explaining the success of WARF's portfolio. The part that I think he downplayed to sort of make himself look better was that, like I said, there's some certain fundamentals of the market that are actually a part of this as well. This is the second generation of WARF's leadership. This is Charles Slichter's son, Don. He was the president of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. He actually chaired the meeting. His predecessor was a man named Edmund Fitzgerald. Don Slichter chaired the meeting that named that boat the Edmund Fitzgerald. I always like to throw that in there. So this is sort of a conundrum for WARF at this time, because what's also happening is that you have, after World War II, the university, or the government is exponentially increasing research funding. And what the government says at that time is that anything that the government funds, there's no de minimis, to use a legal term, which means that if there's a light bulb in your laboratory that was funded by the federal government, then the inventions that you have in that laboratory, we own. You cannot patent them. And that's the status of that. So WARF, it's kind of ironic because WARF is making a lot of money, it's very successful. The Steambox patents have expired. What do you do about that? Well, they diversify. And so I think we'll go through this rather quickly, and I'd say, if there's anything on here that catches your eye, you can ask me about it in the questions. But these are some of the things that WARF does after the war. They fund university houses. Tom Brittingham actually quits over university houses because WARF gives the university a deal. It cuts the interest rate in half for university houses. And what Brittingham says is either it's an investment or it's a donation. It cannot be both. I'm not going to get involved in this if it's not a sound investment, and he quits. Turns out he was right because 5 years later, WARF gives up and donates it back to university. The headline in the Illinois magazine was largest donation in history, which was $2.5 million, I think it was what it was. WARF starts making the Steenbach vitamin concentrates. They start testing that. They're actually pretty important in creating the Enzyme Institute. The Rockefeller money created the Enzyme Institute because WARF built the building. WARF has financed a lot of the buildings on campus. Many of them across the street were financed by WARF. I don't know if this one was. This is the Y-Star building, so WARF helped fund this building. WARF owned the Wisconsin Dells from 1954 to the mid-1990s and actually operated the Dells. So if you've been on a boat tour, WARF ran those for 50 years. The ducks and the boats, the WARF owned those. The two descendants of H.H. Bennett donated the land to WARF because for two reasons. One is that they wanted to make sure it was preserved for conservation reasons, but they also wanted somebody who was a good corporation who could run the ducks. I mean, the ducks didn't exist then, but who could run the concessions, could run the tourists kind of things. And so WARF became a partner with the Olson family for about 50 years and ran that. The other thing that happens is so that then in the 1980s, a sea change. Like I said, the government would claim patent rights to everything. And Howard Bremer was a patent counselor. He was hired in, I think it's either 60 or 61 at WARF, and one of the first things WARF director told him was, you're probably not gonna have a job in a couple of years because we don't think patenting is really gonna be doesn't have much of a future. He didn't take no for an answer. One day, this man, Hector DeLuca, walked into his office. Hector DeLuca happened to be the very last PhD under Harry Steenbach. So he knew a little bit about patenting, but WARF at that point was not really actively pursuing him. He just happened to find Howard Bremer. They collaborated with a man named Norm Latker at the National Institutes of Health. He was a patent counsel there, and they found a waiver called in, do I have that up here? 8.2b waiver, which allowed them to actually patent DeLuca's invention. That then snowballed into what's called an institutional patent agreement with the NIH. And then in the 1970s, Purdue contacted Senator Birch Bayh, talking about the similar problem, and the institutional patent agreement that Howard Bremer had helped write becomes the BayhDole Act of 1980, which essentially says as long as you promise to commercialize the invention and use your inventions to benefit humanity as much as you possibly can, you can patent something. And you have to give the federal government a free lifetime patent or a lifetime license. And if you don't fulfill your obligations, we can march in and take it away from you. And that's the law that happened. That's the law in effect today. That's basically the foundation of the technology transfer industry. And it happens around the same time you have a biotechnology boom in the early 1980s. And so this is what has happened since the BayhDole Act. WARF went from being one of a few places that had a technology transfer office. Whoops, spoiler alert. These are all the patents and startups and things that have happened. The entire technology transfer industry has grown up since 1980. WARF is one of the few places that preceded it. And one of the arguments I try to make in my dissertation is that you can't really tell the story. A lot of people have written about the biotechnology boom, have written about this as this is like the first time that university has been commercialized. Some place like Wisconsin shows you they've been doing it for a long time. And I think it predates WARF. It goes back to the 1880s and 1890s. And if you go to Harvard, maybe that's a different story. But if you come out here in the flyover country, things have been happening like this for a while. And again, we can have arguments about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we got to get the history right, which has been going on for a while. And so I want to finish up here with a couple of statements about what WARF's contributions have been. WARF's endowment at the end of 2016 was $2.6 billion. It's about 2.7 now, give or take Donald Trump's latest statements and how they've affected the stock market. Actually, the stock market's doing pretty good. I shouldn't say that. And then this is the results. You can see, I think this is the market crash right here, but this has been WARF's performance in the last 20 years or so. Cumulative and adjusted for inflation, WARF has given about $2.3 billion in university support. So to try to quantify that, again, with this sort of multiversity approach, this is a little bit of information about how university endowments rank. The top 5 endowments, which you can see with the exception of the UT system, go Longhorns, are Ivy League things. I don't know that I'm actually proud of that. It's all oil money. But the top 5 endowments are $20 billion or more. Harvard's is like $35 billion. This is all 2016 numbers. The top 10 is about plus or minus $10 billion. Michigan and Northwestern are just under that. They're in the top 10. And the top 20, so basically you have $5 billion, you're in the top 20 endowments in the United States. The UW Foundation, which is the UW endowment, which was founded in 1945, has $2.4 billion. You add the WARF endowment to that, you have $5.07 billion. What does that mean? Well, these are the rankings. UW-Madison, this only includes the UW Foundation, is number 33. You can see that puts it above Purdue and Michigan State, behind Penn State and Ohio State. You add WARF money into that, and UW's right there at the top 20. And so the only people above it in the Big Ten are Michigan and Northwestern. Boo, whatever you want to say, right? But it's sorry. So I think what you see here is that I also want to caution, this isn't exactly a very rigorous statistical exercise. You can't just dump that money in there without doing an audit and understanding all of the other sources of revenue at other places. So I don't need to take this as a statistical analysis. It's a metaphor, because I'm a humanist, that's what we do. But I do think it gives you a point that this is the difference between Wisconsin being a mid-tier Big Ten school and being a public Ivy. And I think WARF is one of the reasons why that's the case. So I want to actually then go back to this map to kind of talk about what I think all this means and to do kind of what Gwen did, which is end with sort of what I think the Wisconsin idea means and what this history has taught me and why I think local and act global, what that all means. Like I said, normally people say think global and act local. And what they're getting at is that you should consider the environment, you should think about the globe, you should think about international affairs, you should think about income inequality on a grand scale, but in implementing that, you should recycle, you should volunteer in your community, you should tell your children that they're starving kids in Africa that would love to have those vegetables. Things like that, that's probably not what, but that's kind of what they're getting at, right, is think big, be smart, be sophisticated, but act here. And I think that's great, except when you think about what academics do in particular, but also what politicians do, what global elites do, what the 1% does, is they live globally. They take international trips, they read the New York Times, they don't read the local newspaper. They come to UW and they get a degree and then they go get a job at Washington. Or they get a faculty position here and then they get a promotion that takes them to Harvard or that takes them to Stanford. They're living globally. As academics, we go to international conferences. We publish things in international journals. These are not local actions. This is stuff that we do, and we depend on it. I don't necessarily think it's necessarily a critical or a bad thing, necessarily. But to me, what makes the Wisconsin idea is that more so here than other places, when we do act globally, we tend to remember this kind of stuff. We tend to remember where we came from. And sometimes it's because people in Wisconsin force us to. They do say things like, what are you doing with my taxpayer dollars, right? And I think this map applies to things more than just Badger football. I think it actually is something that, if the Wisconsin idea means anything to me, is that this is a real, practical, lived experience, which is that the people who come here, the people who live here, the people who leave here remember this place in very detailed, practical, lived kind of ways. And I think when I say things like a Chicago lawyer who earned $1 million judgment came back to Wisconsin as Wisconsin's #1 alumnus, right? The WARF is one way that this has happened. I think it's a diverse part. It's not the only way, but I think it's an important way of where that's happened. And I think that's where I'll stop. So, thank you. Yeah. So happy to take any questions. I think we have a microphone to give the people. Yeah.
So remember my lesson and speak right into this so everyone can hear.
Can you go to that slide you had about the funding sources?
Sure.
I think WARF at over $100 million a year.
Okay, so in terms of the WARF grant?
Yeah. Was that about 15% also?
15% of the university budget?
Yeah.
No, it's a slice of that 17%. So that 100 million is not.
Was that slice about equated with the state's percentage?
I would say that if you include UW Foundation's donations, which is alumni-driven donations, then yeah. So the gifts and non-federal grants is 17. That's not all WARF though. WARF is only a portion of that. I don't actually know how to calculate how much.
Could you go to the other one? How much was the foundation? That was
that one?
a real
Yeah.
big slice.
Yes, yeah. Most of them are alumni donations. That's a big chunk of there. I don't know much about their inner workings in terms of what they fund. I mean, the biggest division is that WARF funds research. It used to be just natural sciences research, but it's still just research. So we don't fund teaching or those kinds of things, and that's stuff that UW Foundation helps with.
With warfarin and vitamin D being so large in WARF's income, what percentage of the total income would those two significant discoveries be responsible for?
Well, so two different kinds of vitamin D, because there's the first vitamin D and then there's Hector DeLuca's vitamin D. Hector DeLuca's inventions, I think it's up to like 1,000 patents, but that's over, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but that's a big chunk of it. That's by far the biggest donation. I think that's probably like 50 million, something like that. What I would say is that most of WARF's endowment is from investment income. Warfarin and Steambox patents, adjusted for inflation, are about $200 million. They each earned about 14 to 17 million in real dollars. So that gives you a sense that that's a pretty small portion of 2.5 billion. I've heard today that the stem cell portfolio is about $35 million right about now in terms of what that contributes. But the point of the investment portfolio is it takes that money and exponentially increases it into the billions.
You had a really great slide that, based on the Fibonacci series,
Yeah.
showing all the spin-offs of vitamin D. Is that available someplace to reflect on? Like, do you have a website where? I
think it's perhaps we could post a link to that on the course webpage. I think it's on our website. I don't know if it's exactly in this format, but we definitely have information about our technologies on the website.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
First of all, it was announced in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that UW is 6th highest in patents in the United States. That's really quite remarkable. However, the University of Wisconsin also has, in fact, the state has the largest brain drain many of it from the university. And secondly, the other issue is that it's unclear what the correlation is between that. Is there any effort by the university to retain its remarkable students that it is educating? Also, kudos for having won the suit against Apple as an infringement of a computer app.
That's right.
I don't understand any of that, but apparently it's a big deal. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can speak to that a little bit. Gary Sohi is the inventor of that. The Apple, there's an invention in the iPhone that was invented here, and so the idea was that Wisconsin was not getting any money from that, and that's what that lawsuit is about. It's pending. We don't have that money yet. There's an appeal that's going to be coming up. I like to cite that example because I think it's kind of, in addition to the brain drain, it's also a lot of ways that lawsuit, if WARF didn't have a $2.5 billion endowment, it would not have been able to pursue that lawsuit. And a lot of technology transfer offices can't do that. And I think there's some argument, like I said, there's arguments to be had about whether WARF has always made the right decision. I'd have no problem with WARF suing the largest corporation that makes the largest product in the world. And so yeah, I think to highlight that, I think that's an example of how this is bringing the fruits of Wisconsin's labor back. But I also don't want to pretend that WARF can do that alone. I also don't think Foxconn's going to do that on its own either, right? I also don't think that the train from Milwaukee to Minneapolis would have done that necessarily. Like, this is a huge societal effort. And I think that's something that the history of WARF has taught me more than anything, which is that this isn't about one decision or even one ideology. It's about all of us fighting about this, and it's what comes out of that, what comes out of a serious, caring discussion about what the state is supposed to be and engaging it, and not thinking that we in Madison can pretend that Wausau isn't there, and also not necessarily tolerating it when people from Wausau say, you Madison liberals out of touch, surrounded by reality people. I think WARF has done some things. I can cite a few examples. Aldo Leopold's a famous example. Harry Russell, when he was the dean, knew Leopold and knew that Leopold wasn't happy at the Forest Product Laboratory. So when he became the director of WARF, he was pretty instrumental in using WARF money to create the chair of game management. And so that's brain drain that might have gone somewhere else had Leopold not stayed at Wisconsin and been able to do what he did. So WARF can do some of that. I think retention packages for faculty is something that WARF grant sometimes goes to in the graduate school. We like to say that WARF takes the check up to the board of the campus, drops it off, and leaves. We try to let the vice chancellor deal with how that money is spent. I think that's an important principle, which is to say we're not supposed to interfere. That's not to say that that's always been true. Or it's actually interesting to look at the history, and sometimes the university is the one who's saying, "WARF, can you please come get more involved?" Sometimes things like that will happen. But it's a balance to say that $2.5 billion, $2.7 billion sounds like a lot of money. But it's only a margin of excellence. It's less than 17% of the budget. So I think WARF can do things like, there's a startup initiative that WARF's trying to put a lot more money into to try to make sure that there's ample resources for people who are patenting technologies to create companies here. And the theory that, one of the arguments in the Foxconn debate was that, maybe we need, like, small businesses are the ones who create the most employment. We should be growing those, and we should be growing them here. And I think WARF is trying to be a part of that ecosystem and growing it. I think the other thing to point out is that Madison, there's structural, we're not Boston, we're not Silicon Valley. And so I think some of those rankings that you mentioned, Madison tends to be ranked there. And I don't think people really understand that we need to build Madison here. Our managing director, Eric Iverson, managing director of WARF, has said that, which is he came from Seattle, and he remembers when Seattle was just a little Hamburg. Hamburg? No, it wasn't Hamburg, it was a burg. But he's probably exaggerating, but he saw Seattle grow the wrong way and create a lot of gentrification and create a lot of unaffordable housing and have really terrible public transportation. So a lot of people were having trouble creating businesses there because their employees couldn't get to work on time. And so what he's saying is that we need to create a Madison to grow the right way, which is affordable and livable and retains the things that are good about it. And he makes no claim that he can do that by himself or that we can do that by ourselves. But I think that's the vision we need to be looking at.
Hi, this is a butter margarine question.
Yes.
I think there was some regulation or something a while ago of margarine having to ship the yellow coloring separately. Do you know if Wisconsin had a part in that?
Yeah.
And was it related to beta carotene in any way, or was it just these psychological butter's supposed to be yellow?
It was just psychological. Yeah, it was because it looked better.
Okay.
I mean, it's also a long, long evolution of that. I think in the, actually, my friend John Zuval, who's in the department with me, wrote an article in the Wisconsin Magazine of History called "Not parentheses like Butter," which tells the story of William Dempster Hord, whose bust is out here on the Henry Mall. It's Henry Mall, but Hord's bust is on it, which I think is actually appropriate for reasons of historical importance. But yeah, so originally the idea was that, that nobody understood that margarine was a threat. Then they tried to ban it outright. When they told they couldn't do that, they tried to ban the coloring. And then my understanding is that the Animal Science building, if you look at it, first of all, it has very small windows because it was built in the 70s during the energy crisis. But it was also built with money that essentially, I don't know exactly what happened, but essentially Wisconsin could no longer pass laws banning margarine, so they gave a lot of money to this Animal Science building to basically improve the importance of butter. It's a very central story to WARF. It's something that's very interesting about Steenbach is that he understood where his bread was buttered, so to speak. It's the first time I tried that in public.
Don't ever do it again.
Well, I mean, the other story I like to tell, and I think I almost put this in the presentation, but I'll put it in the questions, which is I think the Babcock butterfat test. I mean, Babcock was trained in Göttingen, Germany. He's a German-trained scientist, and he then took a position at Cornell Agricultural Station. And I mean, he was one of the best trained scientists, best trained chemists in the world. And he comes here, and like I said, he had this idea that I don't think these nutrition he had this in the 1890s, a theory that wasn't ultimately disproven until 20 years later. He thought, we need to test, there's other nutrients happening here. And W.A. Henry said, I'm not gonna let you do that because I don't have the money to do that. I need you to go create a butterfat test that will work. And a guy named Short, I'm forgetting his first name, had tried something. There was a butterfat test here, but because he's this great trained chemist, he gets it right. He figures out the right balance of hydrochloric acid that you use in the churn. And he figured that out. And I think that's another example of where the butter dairy thing, you can say that it's sort of parochial, you can say it's sort of limited, but what it did was the Wisconsin idea is this German trained guy, world-class chemist, comes and he changes Wisconsin and turns it into a dairy state. And I don't think it's either or, it's both of those things. It's somebody saying, no, you're supposed to be doing something practical, and him resisting that. So then what happens is that and several other things, what he was doing with Russell, cold curing of cheese, making Wisconsin the dairy state, 20 years later, the farmers love Wisconsin because of the short course, because of the farmers' institutes, because they're bought in, and because they've seen that, one of the statistics that Mercurdy and Vernon Karstensen say in their history of Wisconsin is that the butterfat test saved more in a single year than what the state was giving to the university at the time. It offset, it paid for the university by itself. And because of that, 20 years later, E.B. Hart's here, Babcock is retired from teaching, and they create the single grain ration experiment. And because of the butterfat test, this becomes a central home for the revolution that became vitamins, and then that produces the vitamin D test. And to me, that's to me the quintessential Wisconsin idea story. It's not the ivory tower versus the workforce needs. It's both of those people being forced to work with each other. And I think that's there's no mistake that the dairy is a science story. This wasn't just sort of destined to be, it's not like the climate is great for dairy here necessarily, although maybe it is. It's that wheat failed and dairy worked because of the scientists that helped there. So part of the downside is that we have some, interesting, embarrassing stories about people clinging to, banning yellow food coloring and driving to the Illinois border to go get your margarine. Or the legislature who was, he said he would have a taste test between margarine and butter to prove that he could tell the difference. And he failed it. And it turned out he failed it because his wife had been feeding him margarine for
Did I hear you say that the language of the Wisconsin idea ended up in legislation in the 1970s?
That's my understanding. Yeah, when I went and looked at that.
What's the story behind that?
I don't know. I think I just looked it up when the controversy happened. It's not my area of specialty. It probably has to do with the creation of the system. Yeah. Okay. It is. I'm getting confirmation here. So yeah. So when the system is created, that's an opportunity to change the statutes, and so that's when it gets included. Like I said, I certainly have no objection to that. I think it's a good thing.
Do you see the UW helping to innovate and lead to large-scale organic and to polyculture agriculture, given a lot of the downsides to conventional reliance on corn and soybeans? And yeah.
I certainly hope so. I don't know. It's something also that our licensing managers at WARF and obviously CALS will know about kind of what's in the pipeline there. I'm not aware of anything right now that would necessarily speak to that. I know that there's things like the flooring they just put in Union South, which is using basically crop waste as energy and things like that. But I hope so.
How would cows be directly involved? Are you talking about Center on Wisconsin Strategy?
CALS, College of Agriculture and Life Sciences.
Oh, sorry.
That's my Texas, Illinois accent, I guess.
Hold on, I was just going to say, like cats.
Oh, yeah.
On your diagram, it seems as though a number of these successes are in medicine.
So you probably medical physics.
Yeah.
So MRIs, things. Yeah, I mean it's an area of strength. I don't know the full history behind that, but I know that when part of it grows out of if you have strength in one biological science, then you tend to attract funding, and that actually that tends to multiply. And it's obviously been a biological science strong campus. And that's something I would say come to Wednesday night at the lab to learn more about those things. But it's also something that I think is also when WARF develops a strong relationship, that relationship can produce other discoveries along the way. But yeah, computer science is another strong area. But I don't think it's also if you look at the string of presidents leading up to Fred Harvey Harrington, they're all biochemists who were hired by or worked with E.B. Hart and worked with Russell, LVM, E.B. Fred. It's the strength of this campus, and I think that's. I also being an intellectual historian of institutions, I tend to default to institutional explanations. I think the strength of institutions perpetuate themselves. I think that's probably what my default answer. But
to follow up on the
question about medical aspects. We didn't have our first physicians graduated from this place till 1927. Yeah. We had the Attic Medical School, and most people don't realize that. And I think in our history, it's amazing we can't cite any public health stuff until very late in the research development here. How do we compare to other places in electronics? And do you still see echoes of that today where our medical school ranks compared to our peers in terms of patenting, in terms of ranking and that type of thing?
I don't actually know much about the ranking of the medical school. I can say it's actually, that's another institutional explanation. Medical schools and technology transfer offices always have a little bit of friction because medical schools tend to be independent. They tend to want to control, like they leave it to doctors to be very self-important, I guess. Sorry, that's nitpicky. But
it's recorded. Don't worry.
Yeah. No, I don't mean to actually create catty about it. But medical schools and hospitals tend to have their own separate institutional focus, and a lot of them try to patent their own things. And so it's in certain ways a separate kind of question that I don't know that I have my head around. I mean, I know that 1927 is late, but it's also it's the early 20th century when, with the Flexner Report and things like that one school education is being really professionalized and really growing along there. So I don't know that Wisconsin is late in terms of like decades. But one reason why it's 27 and not 25 is because the General Education Board was going to be giving a donation to help create the medical school, and the Rockefeller Foundation was influential in shaping that. So there's a certain way I could say that Wisconsin has some credit by following its own course and building its own medical school on its own terms. But yeah, I don't know that I have strong data to speak to your questions, but that's the best I can do.
If I could follow up on that, you mentioned
Wisconsin Foundation.
Does anybody work here that can do this? Oh yeah, I do. You mentioned UW Foundation, and you mentioned WARF. What's the status, in your opinion, of the UW Medical Foundation, which came about 20 years ago? from Blue Cross Blue Shield? Because that is a third large source of money for this institution.
I think that's actually a good point. I probably should have looked at that. I don't actually know what the status of their endowment is or how it. Well, and when Blue Cross and Blue Shield, when they merged, there was like a lot of that money went into the foundation, right?
Well, they didn't merge; they went private.
Right. Okay. There was an exchange of money there. Yeah, I actually don't know the total, and that's also why I said that it's not a statistical example. It's sort of an illustration, is that lots of universities have different organizations like that in different foundations. But I mean, I think the medical foundation, I think that goes to the medical school. So it's a little bit. I don't think it's distributed the same way that like the foundation is, or the way WARF is. It's not enterprise wide in that respect, I think. Any other questions?
I can speak loudly.
Some folks at home actually.
Oh, I see.
I
Okay.
appreciate that.
Okay.
I'm gonna break this.
So we have a rather diverse portfolio. No single part of it accounts for a huge percentage.
Mm.
And you had mentioned one of the articles of debate in setting up WARF to begin with was, should we take X amount of Rockefeller dollars and be beholding to, what mechanisms are in place? And you thought perhaps WARF was set up local dollars, local people in Wisconsin, less of an issue, but what mechanisms are in place to prevent any corporation or any individual from having too much say in how money might be spent?
In terms of WARF money, or in terms of generally speaking donations?
Either or.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so one thing is in WARF, there's, I don't know the current number, but it's 15 or 17 trustees with a diverse background. And part of that is the same way that the idea of a board in any corporation is to ensure that the corporation is adhering to its articles, however successful that may be. The other one is the IRS, that WARF money can't go anywhere other than what's in its charter. So that we would lose our tax exempt status if we were to give anywhere else. So that's the answer for WARF. The other thing too, the chancellor sits on the board since about 2000. That was also a protection against IRS investigations into whether WARF was doing the right thing, as the WARF put the chancellor on the board. So there is that involvement. I think, generally speaking, I think WARF has historically, in a few examples, been on the side of saying so Wisconsin is unique in the fact that individuals are presumed to own their intellectual property. That changes if there's federal money involved, because BayhDole says the federal government has to be involved, they have to follow those regulations. So, but the way that the relationship between UW and WARF works is that UW says if there's federal funding involved, you have to go to WARF. If there's not federal money involved and there's not sponsorship dollars attached, then you actually have the right to go and patent that yourself. WARF's position, and UW strongly encourages you go to WARF because we do this for a living, and professors don't. But I think that's also part of the DNA of the Wisconsin idea, which is that we privilege individual academic freedom. And that also feeds into shared governance at the university, which is a very strong tradition. And I think that's something that if Dow Chemical or Apple or IBM comes in and says, we want to buy your business school, or we want to buy your medical school, shared governance would stop that from happening. If it's robust. I mean, that's one reason to make sure that we're engaging in shared governance and keeping it strong. So those are the ideas that come to mind. It's also true that Steenbach, some of his assistants were funded by corporate money and corporate sponsorships, industrial sponsorships. So it's definitely there, and that's a very tricky question within the field that I work in, which is how do you untangle that? How do you understand how that money is influencing them? And how do you put safeguards in place? And can you ever do that? And the answer probably is, the dairy industry obviously influenced the growth of this institution. So,
all right, one final comment from me, and then a reminder. Final comment is, I finally understand what happened when I was a child in Janesville. Why we would get in the car and drive to South Beloit to buy margarine that was yellow.
Yeah.
It didn't really make a lot of sense to me at the time. Now it does. Thank you. And I remind everyone that next week's presentation will be across the street. So please join me in thanking you.